To understand the Battle of Thermopylae, you've really got to understand why the Persians were in Greece at all, because if taken out of context, it looks like a relatively minor engagement from the Persian perspective. The Battle of Marathon had happened 10 years before in 490 BC, and that had ended the first Persian invasion of Greece, under Darius I, who was invading Greece with good reason. To understand the good reason, we have to rewind the clock about 70 years to 560 BC. At the time, Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, was dominated by a kingdom called Lydia, led by King Croesus, the king who gave his name eponymously to the term rich as Croesus. He conquered the Greek colonies that lay across the western seaboard, which was known as Ionia because they were broadly descended from the Ionian Greeks of the mainland, the most prominent of which were the Athenians, instead of the Dorian Greeks, the most prominent of which were the Spartans. So in 560 BC, the Lydian Empire conquered the Ionian cities of the coast, and this state of affairs remained until 14 years later, Persian King Cyrus the Great conquered the Lydian Empire. Now, I'm washing over a vast amount of details as I tell you this, because otherwise we'll never get to the point. But during his conquest of Lydia, Cyrus asked the Ionian cities to revolt, and they didn't. However, after Cyrus had completed his conquest of Lydia and taken Sardis, the Ionian cities prostrated themselves before Cyrus on condition that they received the same terms that they had been given under Croesus. Now, if you know anything about Cyrus the Great, you'll know that he was usually a pretty amicable guy. So when Cyrus refused, citing their refusal to simply submit to him willingly, the Ionians had to defend themselves, because Cyrus sent a general called Harpagus, a Mede, to go and conquer them and impose Persian terms on them. Again, this wasn't really the sort of usual thing Persians would do. Cyrus, in fact, made a wonderful name for himself for being a humanitarian and for being a great forgiver of his enemies. So it's rather surprising that he would do this. The Ionians failed to cooperate and failed to fight off the Persians. They probably didn't have the option to do so even if they wanted to, given the strength of the Persians at the time. Each city was individually conquered, and a tyrant was installed who was loyal to the Persians and supported by them with money and men. However, this made the Ionians rather difficult to rule. The usual way the Persians would rule over a people is by using a powerful native group to support the Persian rule. However, in the Ionian cities there wasn't really any such thing. There were aristocracies, but they were always fighting amongst themselves. There wasn't a particularly powerful or commanding priesthood, so there was simply no way of raise one section of Ionian society above another to maintain the Persian hegemony. Given the obstreperous nature of the Ionians, I've got no doubt that Cyrus must have thought to himself that things would have been better if he had simply accepted the terms to which the Ionians had remained loyal to the Lydians. So Ionia was relatively unsettled but under Persian rule, through the use of tyrants, until around 499 BC, when the tyrant of Miletus, called Aristagoras, decided to petition Darius the Great to allow him to attempt to conquer the island of Naxos. This was a debacle, and after 4 months of a siege and having run out of money, the Miletian tyrant and his force returned to Asia Minor. Aristagoras probably thought that he was going to be replaced as tyrant, given the debacle that the invasion had turned out to be and the complete waste of men and money that it had entailed. So he effectively incited the rebellion of Ionia against the Persian Empire. And this is where the mainland Greeks come in. After realizing that simply the Ionians revolting against the vast Persian Empire probably wasn't going to result in a victory for the Ionians, so he sailed for mainland Greece, straight to Sparta, the faction that would most commonly be asked to lead the Greeks whenever there was a military coalition. The Spartans said no. They had no particular desire to fight the Persians, and they had no reason to help the Ionians especially. And so Aristagoras decided to instead go to Athens. And here's where things get a bit complicated. Athens had only recently become a democracy, overthrowing Hippias, the tyrant of Athens. To establish the democracy, the Athenians had actually appealed to the Persians for help in return for becoming a vassal of Persia, which I know you might think sounds like a bizarre thing to do, but they did it. In the end, they didn't need Persian help to do this and to establish the democracy, but that really wasn't anything to do with the Persian opinion. When the overthrown tyrant Hippias went to Persian satrap Artaphernes, he asked him to come and help him subjugate Athens and make him the tyrant there again. The Athenian democracy sent a delegation of ambassadors to him to dissuade him from doing this. But Artaphernes simply said, look, you're going to have to take Hippias back as tyrant. You've put yourself under Persian power. Do as you are told. The Athenians obviously could not accept this, and so simply decided to be at war with Persia. And it's because they were already at war with Persia that Athens decided that they would quite happily support the Ionian cities in their revolt. And I'm sure that the fact that the Athenians were Ionians as well played no small part in that decision. So the following year, in 498 BC, the Athenians and the Eretrians sent a force of 25 triremes combined, 20 from Athens, 5 from Eretria, to assist the Ionians in their revolt against the Persians. The Persians were caught rather flat-footed, and when the combined Greek army marched on the ex-capital of Lydia, Sardis, which was now the capital of the satrapy, and the place from which Artaphernes was governing Asia Minor, they found it relatively undefended and had no problem taking possession of the city. Artaphernes and his forces retreated to the citadel, the Acropolis, to presumably await reinforcements and relief, and in the meantime somehow the city caught fire and effectively began to burn down. The Athenians and the Persians both evacuated the city, and the Athenians decided to return to Ionia. The Greeks decided to return to Ionia. On this march back, the Persians were reinforced and chased them down and defeated them. This happened at the Battle of Ephesus, and the survivors effectively escaped home, but the Persians didn't follow up on their victory, probably because the army that defeated the Greeks wasn't equipped to siege great cities. This tarrying wasn't to the Persians' benefit, as this allowed the revolt to continue to spread, despite this defeat. But after this defeat, the Athenians decided to end their alliance with the Ionians, and no longer give any assistance. Now, I'm telling you all of this because, and you can probably see why anyway, but without it, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that the Persians would assemble the largest army in history to invade a minor group of city-states controlled by people whom history had never heard of until this point. But when Darius the Great decided to invade Greece, he did so because his vassal states had revolted against him. They had burned down the capital of his province, and being the mighty king of kings, he had to do something about it. The expedition he sent to Greece, he didn't go on himself. He sent a commander called Datis to command the Persian forces in his stead. And after they were defeated at Marathon, Darius began to plan a second expedition against the Greek states, this time with himself at the head. He spent 3 years preparing men and ships for war, until distracted by revolts elsewhere in his empire, and he himself died in 480 BC. The throne was then inherited by his eldest son Xerxes, who continued on his father's plans for the invasion of Greece, which he launched at the beginning of 480 BC. Now, there is no doubt that Xerxes had a colossal army, and I'm not going to go into the veracity of the numbers reported to us, because we're told that they had millions of men. The Persian Empire probably ruled between about 15 to 50 million people, so it's not impossible that the Persians had, the Persians at least had access to that many men, so to say it isn't the least believable thing in the world, especially if you were an ancient Greek who was well aware that the Persian Empire was absolutely colossal. I mean, the Greeks didn't even know how big Persia was. They just knew it was huge. They knew it was a world-spanning empire. As far as they were concerned, it ruled everything east of Greece. So when they heard that in Asia Minor Xerxes was mustering the largest army ever known, they sent spies out to examine it. These spies were captured, and Xerxes simply had them led around the army. He had them view how they were counting out the number of men. The Persians would count out 10,000 men, arrange them in a square, draw a square around them or a circle around them, and then move those men across the Hellespont into mainland Europe, and then have another 10,000 men, but not uncounted, just fill the area that the 10,000 had previously been stood on, and then ferry them across. And this was how they counted the number of men in their army. Now, I think this is actually a remarkably accurate way of counting. The difference between each group of 10,000 shifted across is going to be fairly low. However, again, they thought 3 million men had come to Greece. There have been numerous studies done on the physical practicality of this, including one of the most famous ones, or the most interesting ones that I've seen, was a study on the rivers of Greece and how many people could the rivers, the fresh water of Greece, actually supported. This was done, I think, by a British military commander. I think it was in the early 20th century. I should have looked it up before I did this. But basically, he didn't think that more than 1.5 million could possibly have come in with all of the water resources in Greece. Now, we are given accounts that the Persian army would drink rivers dry. So, I mean, I'm not saying that they had 1 million plus men, but I am saying that it was clearly a colossal force. Now, there's, hundreds of thousands, at least. I'm more than happy to... I mean, the modern estimates are around 300,000 at the most. I'm happy to entertain numbers like that. Personally, I would probably be happy to entertain larger numbers, because these people weren't incompetent. They weren't incapable of assessing their own needs and what their own resources were. The Persians ruled over the largest and most technologically advanced empire of the day. I'm sure that the quartermasters knew exactly how many men they had to feed. But anyway, all we really need to take away from this is that the Persians had an unreasonably large army. And, I mean, far larger than any army any of the Greeks would ever have seen, or even imagined being in one place. It's a colossal army. It's so big, it's world-ending. It's just so far outside of the Greek scope of warfare. This is totally new to them. So the Greek cities of the mainland begin to panic. It's quite evident that you don't assemble a force so large to simply chastise a revolting vassal. It's unreasonable to think that that was the case. And as Xerxes marched his army around the north of Greece, he subjugated everything in his path and incorporated them into the Persian Empire, put garrisons in their cities, and carried on. In this manner, he took all of northern Greece from the Hellespont to the Bosphorus, accepted the subjugation of the Kingdom of Macedon, and then continued down into mainland Greece, into Boeotia, or towards it, where we meet the Spartans and the rest of the Greek Confederacy, or at least their advanced force, at Thermopylae. The reason the Greeks are in this confederacy is because they are well aware that the Persians have come to conquer and annex Greece. They are going to lose their liberty, and they are going to become vassals of Persia, if they don't fight. And as we saw from the description of the Battle of Marathon, it's a very brave thing to do in itself, because the Persians have a legendary reputation. One that was only recently, 10 years prior, even dented by the Athenian victory at Marathon. As with almost every confederation of Greeks that involved the Spartans were put at the head because the Spartans were professional soldiers. At least the Spartiates were, the homoi, the similars, they were called. They were all men who were given a package of land by the state and a number of helot slaves to till it, and then they would be refused from performing any kind of agriculture, commerce, or manufacturing in exchange for exclusively drilling for war. As you can imagine, this gave the Spartans a sterling reputation as a first-rate Greek military power amongst the Greeks, which is why when Darius I first invaded Greece, the Spartans sent their envoy to him and said, if you do this, you'll have to deal with the Spartans. And they had the pomp and the audacity to go to the king of Persia and say this, and he was just, I've never heard of the Spartans. I don't know, what is that impressive? That's impressive, right? I didn't know. But they thought that they were impressive because the other Greeks had this opinion of them. And they were. I'm sure they were also very, very, very good. There's no doubt about it. Professional soldiers are always better than amateur part-time soldiers. What's interesting is the importance of Leonidas to this battle, and the morale boost that he gives to the entire thing. Leonidas is the unexpected king of Sparta. He had two older brothers who both died young, and so he becomes one of the dual kings of Sparta. He's important because he is a descendant of Hercules, which, as the Greeks were very superstitious, was particularly important. And he is important because when the Persians invaded Greece, the oracle at Delphi issued a prophecy to say, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me, that either Sparta will end up burning or one of her kings will die in battle. And the king specifically would be a descendant of the line of Hercules. This is undoubtedly why Leonidas decided to bring with him his 300 men, a retinue, of men who had all existing living sons. He knew he was going on a suicide mission. Therefore, he had picked men who he knew would be survived by their family and their line would continue. Now, these 300 Spartans are made much of in myth and history, and even from Herodotus himself. At the time, there was a lot of fuss made over them because the Spartans were the leading military power of Greece. But in total, there were around 4,000 Greeks there, so the number of Spartans at Thermopylae was remarkably low, given just the number of troops involved in the battle anyway. So Thermopylae was chosen because at the time it was a very narrow pass with a single track going along the shore of the Malian Gulf, so narrow that only one chariot could pass across it at a time. This was, of course, the most tactically sound place to attempt to resist the Persians. Herodotus tells us that the Persian army was largely inexperienced, which it probably was, mostly made up of fresh recruits from all across Asia who have been called up to come and invade Greece, whereas it's entirely likely that the Greeks had experience of war from the internecine conflicts between the city-states. Each citizen that could afford it was expected to be a hoplite and fight for their city. The battles were never that fearsome or that intense, but there was quite a lot of low-level warfare going on. And they were, of course, being led by professional soldiers in the form of the Spartans. Now, the Persians obviously had their own professional soldiers as well. The Persians and the Medes were the elite troops of the Persian army, and the Persian immortals were 10,000 strong and made up the Persian king's elite bodyguard. The Persians had arrived in Greece relatively quickly. Xerxes had conducted, frankly, quite a lightning campaign across northern Greece, especially with the size of his force, and so the Greeks were relatively unprepared for them to be so close so quickly. The Persian scouts, as Herodotus relates, arrived at the pass and found the Spartans outside of the walls, which had recently been rebuilt, doing their hair and doing exercise, which was completely normal for the Spartans when they thought they were going into some sort of mortal conflict. Whereas this must have been quite unusual from the Persian perspective, even though they had already been warned that the Spartans were not like other men that they had faced. Xerxes decided to wait 4 days, which, when you think about it, must have been a really big decision, because when you have so many men in such a confined area, fresh water and food must have been a serious issue. So when he came to attack on the 4th day, after the Greeks clearly showed no sign of being overawed by the vast number of the Persians, then he may well have done so due to dwindling supplies. One of the interesting things that we're told is that and like I was saying earlier, the Greeks probably had more experience than the Persians, and they were definitely better armed. At least better armed than the average conscript. The elite troops probably would have been as well armed as the Greeks. Maybe in a different fashion, but at least with equipment that was pretty good. But we know that the Greeks tended to use longer spears and had very sturdy shields faced with bronze, and had a very compact, very defensive formation in the phalanx, where each shield was interlocked with the neighbour's shield, to create a very strong shield wall that was then bristling with spear points, which were, as we're told, longer than the Persian spears. Combined with the Greeks' greater experience, at least partially, this effectively made them really impossible to break through. And so when Darius began sending tens of thousands of troops to overwhelm this number, they found themselves, well, just hitting a wall of bronze and losing thousands and thousands of men. Now, again, we don't know how many men were lost. Herodotus tells us around 20,000, which is a colossal number. I mean, that would be it's hard to believe that 20,000 men died there, just because it's such a large number. But again, I don't know, so I'm not going to make any judgments. But it was obviously a very, very disproportionate number of Persians, given the number of Greeks holding the pass, and they picked this pass for a reason. It eliminated the Persians' numerical advantage, and so it reduced it to an equal number of Persians and Greeks fighting for the period of time that they were engaged, and the Greeks had better equipment and were better experienced, and without doubt had better morale. Herodotus mentions that the Persian army was often whipped into going forward, which, again, I don't know whether this is true, because much of, and I'm not going to go into a defense of Herodotus here, but much of what he says isn't, he's unfairly maligned as being a liar, when in fact what he often says is, look, I'm bound to relate what I've been told, but not in every case to believe it. So he's just telling people what he's been told, because the histories means the inquiries. He has gone to people, he has asked for their information, he's been told something, he's written it down and gone, well, and often he does turn around and say, look, I simply don't believe what I've been told here, but this is the information. So, after 2 days of the fighting going nowhere, Xerxes is furious. During the battles, he's literally on his feet, screeching and raging, and terrified for the damage this is doing to his army. He can't believe this is happening. He doesn't know what to do. He's absolutely confounded. Naturally, he's under the impression that the Greeks were doubtless tired and wounded. How could they still be resisting? And they probably were tired and wounded, or many of them anyway. But the Greeks had been rotating their lines, so whenever there was a break in the fighting, the front exhausted line would be replaced with the fresh rear line, and so on and so forth. The Spartans were also very well trained in certain military maneuvers, because this is what the Spartans did, and so they would do something called a feigned retreat, which is to pretend to your enemy that you are fleeing, and the enemy, seeing you run, is encouraged to chase you down, because there is never an easier time to kill a man in battle than when his back is to you. Of course, when the Persians start closing in on the Spartans turn, lock their shields, and begin butchering Persians who are now in no formation whatsoever. This, again, is a very difficult maneuver to pull off and requires a lot of training, but apparently we're told that this is what they did, and it was very successful. So the Greeks managed to simply continue resisting Xerxes' giant army, and Xerxes doesn't know what to do. And who knows what would have happened if Ephialtes had not turned up in the nick of time to save Xerxes' campaign. There is only a certain amount of times you can send men to their deaths at the hands of the Greeks for them to turn around and say, look, we're not going to do it. So, if the Greeks had held out, there may well have been some kind of revolt within Xerxes' army, because what he was proposing that they do was simply get massacred. It certainly wasn't an advantageous situation for the Persians, and yet, as far as Xerxes was aware, there was no other way to get through here. Especially as, at the same day, there was a giant naval action, or at least over the same 3 days, sorry. There was a giant naval action taking place off the coast at a place called Artemisium, which I will actually detail in the next episode of this kind of, I guess this turned into a podcast. Ephialtes was a local Greek man who was a traitor. Now, in 300, he was portrayed as a hunchback, but we've got no reason to think that he was. There was nothing about that written down anywhere, so it just seems that was embellishment for the sake of it, which I personally don't mind, but it's not historically accurate. However, he decided for vast wealth he would tell Xerxes about a goat trail that led over the mountains and around behind the position of the Greek forces. And that's all she wrote. You can imagine exactly how this went. Xerxes was immediately heartened and sent 20,000 men under Hydarnes over the mountain. Now, this mountain path was being guarded by the Phocians, who only had about 1,000 men, and weren't really keeping very good guard. You would think they would have had men posted further down the path to keep a watch, keep an eye out, just in case somehow the Persians discovered this path up the mountain. I mean, you would think that there would be some sort of preparations, but they weren't, and they were caught completely off guard. So the men, the Immortals under Hydarnes, and the rest of the Persian force came face to face with a body of men who were busy trying to arm themselves because they'd barely any time in advance, and there was panic in Hydarnes' force. They thought that this was more Spartans, and by this time the name of the Spartans had resonated throughout the Persian force, and they were afraid of them. However, Ephialtes was with them and explained that no, these were just normal plebs, these were the Phocians, nothing to be afraid of, and the Persians attacked. Like I said, the Phocians were outnumbered 20-1, so they retreated to a nearby sort of peak, and frankly prepared to die. But instead, Hydarnes just marched his army past, because these people weren't the target. Their force was far too small to do any significant damage to his, and they had a job to do. And there was not really anything the Phocians could do other than let them walk past. Now, I don't actually know what happened to the Phocians after this. I assume they just retreated back down a different path or something and went back to focus. But, I mean, it's hard to believe that they were just like, oh, well, I guess the Persians are going around then. We'll just do nothing. You know, you would think that they would attempt to harry or harass the Persian force on their way down the mountain or something, wouldn't you? But again, I simply don't know. I have no idea what happened to them, and Herodotus doesn't record it, and so it may be known somewhere, I'm just not aware of it. And so this is what happened on the third day, and the Greeks learn about this when it's too late. They have been outflanked, and they know that they're going to be cut off. And so before they're cut off, Herodotus tells us that Leonidas dismisses the Greek contingents. This was no doubt prudence on the part of Leonidas. There was simply no need to get thousands of good, experienced soldiers butchered when outflanked at Thermopylae. You know, regardless of any notions of honour, this was a silly move to remain in this position when you knew you were going to be defeated. So I agree with Herodotus when he says that he thinks Leonidas dismissed them. I think that's probably a case of what he did as well. Leonidas is clearly quite an able general, and any able general would have done the same. The only contingent that Leonidas didn't dismiss were the Thebans. Now, I don't know whether Thebes is getting a bad rap or not, because it does seem that multiple times they are relatively duplicitous and relatively avaricious in the things that in the decisions that Thebes as a state makes, and they're generally not very well regarded by the other Greeks or trusted. And the reason that Leonidas doesn't allow them to go is because Thebes has had Persian sympathies, and so he consigns these 400 Thebans to death. So along with the remaining 300 Spartans and the 400 Thebans were the contingent of 700 Thespians. Now, Thespiae is a very small city-state in Boeotia, and did nothing of any note, apart from Thespian hoplites would repeatedly fight to the death. Now, if you play a total war game or something like that, you might think, well, that was what Spartan hoplites did. No, that's not what Spartan hoplites did. This is the only example I can find of Spartan hoplites fighting to the death when unreasonably outmatched. However, this is something that the Thespians simply chose to do every single time. I probably should have looked this up in advance, but off the top of my head, another instance of this I can think of is the Battle of Dien Im in the Peloponnesian War, where the Thespians are put against the Athenians, and they, instead of being driven back with the rest of the contingent on the Athenian wing, or the wing facing the Athenians, the Thespians simply just stand still and hold their ground, while the Athenians entirely envelop them, to the point where the Athenians are sort of fighting each other as they come around and bend their force around the tiny Thespian line. But they just stand there and just get butchered to a man. And that's the same that they do at Thermopylae. There seems to be some particularly bloody-minded streak of confidence or arrogance or courage or pride in the Thespians where they simply refuse to retreat. And that, for me, gives them a lot of charm. So the remaining men probably came to around 1,000 men, and they, instead of staying behind the rebuilt wall and staying in the narrow area of Thermopylae where they're about to get sandwiched between two larger, much larger Persian forces, they instead decide to spread out to advance on the Persians. And this is, of course, surprising to the Persians. And they begin to fight with unrestrained fury. And this is where the legends are made. This is where the impression of the Greeks is really felt on the Persians. Because they fight like animals. They are just... I mean, Herodotus tells us, the spears are broken, they're down to the swords, and the battle continues all day until Hadani's force arrives at the rear, when the Thebans retreat to a hill and are cut off from the remaining Greeks, who are now defending themselves with their hands and teeth and anything they can grab. And eventually they are simply shot to death by Persian arrows, because engaging them in man-on-man combat is simply not worth it to the Persians. Despite their vast numbers, there is no need to get men killed unnecessarily. And from the Persian perspective, so many men had been killed unnecessarily at Thermopylae. Leonidas dies in a midpoint during the day, and the Greeks and Persians have to contest for his body. The Greeks manage to capture it for a time at least, but it does no particular good. There were only 2 Spartan survivors from the Battle of Thermopylae. One of them was called Eurytus, who was a Spartan warrior who had been stricken with an eye disease, and dismissed by Leonidas and told to return back to Sparta. However, on the way he for some reason told his helot slave, presumably because he knew what was going to occur when he arrived back, to instead turn him around even though he was blind and take him back to the battle, which he did do and then was slain. The other survivor was Aristodemus, who actually did manage to get back to Sparta. He was also stricken with the same eye disease. Back in Sparta he was called the Trembler, or the Coward, and no man would give him a light for his fire or speak to him. He was totally ostracized for failing to die at Thermopylae with the rest of the army. Given his ill treatment in Sparta, despite the fact that he was dismissed, Aristodemus ended up rejoining the Spartan army for the Battle of Plataea the following year, the decisive battle that ended up ending the second Persian invasion of Greece, where he broke from the ranks and, in a berserker-like rage, charged into the Persian lines and killed several before being killed himself. This caused the Spartans to remove the shame that was invoked along with his name, but they didn't give him any special honours because being reckless and suicidal was most certainly not a Spartan virtue. But at least he did redeem himself. There was actually a third survivor of the 300, but a man who wasn't at the battle, called Pantites, who'd been sent by Leonidas on an embassy to Thessaly, and he didn't get back to Thermopylae in time for the battle. Again, he found himself disgraced in Sparta and ended up hanging himself. There has always been the question of, was the Battle of Thermopylae necessary, hanging over this battle? And I'm not sure that it was. There's absolutely no mention by Herodotus that the casualties inflicted on the Persian army were particularly grievous. I mean, they may have been very large, but the Persian army was very large. And the Persians then went on to conquer the rest of mainland Greece. They captured and sacked and burned Athens, which was the entire purpose of the Persian invasion, after which Darius simply declared victory and sailed home. It's often said that the importance of Thermopylae was as a delaying action, but it took Xerxes a month to reach Athens, so the delay of 1 week probably wasn't all that instrumental in helping the Athenians evacuate their city. What I'm saying is basically the Battle of Thermopylae was not a decisive battle. It didn't hinder the Persians. It didn't enable the Greeks to find some sort of strategic advantage they wouldn't have already had, and it didn't really change the outcome of the events that happened. Honestly, it seems that Xerxes simply thought that Greece was too much work. It wasn't particularly rich, it wasn't going to be easy to govern, and he had a giant, wealthy empire to rule back in Asia. So after conquering Athens and conquering everything around except for the Peloponnese, he went home, and he left Mardonius with about 70,000 men to complete the conquest. This, of course, was unsuccessful, as he was defeated at the Battle of Plataea, but But realistically, if the Greeks had not fought at Thermopylae, it's likely that not all that much would have changed. The real impact from Thermopylae was morale. It probably surprised Xerxes greatly to see such resistance on the part of the Greeks, and to see his own troops simply find themselves stuck against the wall of bronze. It also doubtless really inspired the men who were also fighting in the war, and probably inspired others to join. And ultimately, we are here now talking about it because it's so goddamn heroic. It's just so heroic. There is definitely a great deal of romance about the Battle of Thermopylae, and not unfairly. It must have taken great courage on behalf of the Greeks. So this has turned into some sort of podcast, and I might turn these commentaries into a podcast or something like that, because the next one I'm doing is the Battle of Artemisium, which is the 3-day naval action that took place at the same time as the Battle of Thermopylae, where the vastly outnumbered Greek fleet decides to very boldly engage the huge Persian fleet in open waters. They just give them hell. But I'll discuss that next time.